The teeth of the shredder didn't hum, they ground. It was a heavy industrial crunch that chewed through 200-pound cotton stock paper, the kind bearing the embossed silver crest of the United States Air Force Academy. An oversight in management, Eleanor Vance said. She didn't look up from her iPad where she was casually reviewing the quarterly logistics margins for Vance Global Logistics. Her fingers tipped with flawless blood-red manicures swiped left. A temporary clerical error. I've already contacted the admissions board at Colorado Springs. I informed them you have a prior binding civil obligation. Your slot has been reassigned to a candidate from Ohio. Rayna stood frozen on the Persian rug in the center of the third-floor library. The air in the Vance estate always smelled of beeswax old money and the suffocating chill of central air conditioning that kept the humidity from ruining the oil paintings of men who had never bled for a single dollar they owned. On the mahogany desk lay the remnants of her life, her perfect 4.0 transcript from the elite preparatory academy she'd attended on a half scholarship, her physical endurance certificates, and the letter signed by a 3-star general granting her a rare direct appointment billet into the Night Strike Tactical Fighter Wing. "That was my commission," Rayna said. Her voice didn't shake, but it was thin-stripped of oxygen. "I earned the top command scholarship in the Eastern Seaboard region." "Eleanor, look at me." Eleanor set the tablet down with a soft, deliberate clack. Her eyes, a pale, predatory gray that Rayna had spent 18 years trying to read, for a hint of warmth leveled across the desk. "You are a line item, Rayna," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into that smooth, terrifyingly calm register she used during hostile board takeovers. "And currently, you are a depreciating asset. For 18 years, this family has subsidized your food, your private schooling, and your medical care. Do you know what the return on investment for a daughter is in our circle? It is not a uniform. It is not grease under your fingernails, flying government property into the dirt for $40,000 a year." She leaned forward, resting her chin on her interlaced fingers. "Your brother Julian takes his seat on the board of directors next month. The Vance name requires liquid capital to secure the North Sea drilling leases. Next week you will accompany me to New York. You will sit at the table with the eldest son of the Sterling oil conglomerate. You will smile. You will sign the prenuptial agreement, and you will transfer your trust's voting rights to Julian. That is your purpose. That is the only duty your blood demands of you." "And if I say no?" Eleanor smiled. It was a small, tight movement of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. "There is no child. Without the Vance name, you are a legal zero. You have no credit line, no property, and no standing. You will do what daughters of this house have done for 3 generations. You will be the bridge over which the men of this family walk to power." Rayna looked at the wastebasket beneath the shredder. The silver crest of the Air Force was now just confetti. Something inside her, a fragile, desperate hope that her mother's blood still mattered in this house, snapped with the clean, quiet finality of a dry twig. "Julian can have the seat," Rayna whispered. "He can have the whole damn kingdom." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the heavy oak doors open behind her. The storm hit New England 3 hours later, a nor'easter that dropped the temperature into the low teens and coated the asphalt in a sheet of black ice. Rayna didn't pack a suitcase. To take their silk, their cashmere, or their leather would be to accept their terms. Instead, she went to the cedar chest in the attic, the one belonging to her late father, before Eleanor had systematically scrubbed his memory from the lower floors. Inside, she found it an old olive-drab canvas military rucksack from his time in the logistics corps. It was rough, smelled of mothballs and damp canvas, and the brass buckles were tarnished green. She stuffed it with 3 pairs of jeans, 2 thermal shirts, her birth certificate, and $84 she had saved from selling her old textbooks back to the campus store. When she stepped out of the servants' entrance into the gale, the wind hit her like a physical blow. The driveway of the Vance estate was a mile long, lined with ancient frozen oaks that groaned under the weight of the ice. Every breath she took tasted like needles. Her sneakers wholly inadequate for a blizzard soaked through within minutes, the freezing water turning her toes numb. She didn't look back at the lights of the mansion. By midnight, she was walking along the shoulder of Route 1, her face raw and bleeding from the wind-driven sleet. Her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a thin denim jacket were shaking so violently she could barely feel her fingers. Twice, semi-trucks roared past, blinding her with their high beams and spraying her with a slush of freezing salt and gravel that knocked her into the ditch. She crawled out of the snowbank on her hands and knees, the canvas straps of the rucksack cutting deep into her shoulders like dull knives. "You are a legal zero." Eleanor's voice echoed in the rhythm of her freezing heartbeat. "A depreciating asset." "No," Rayna muttered into the wind, her teeth chattering so hard she bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. "No." She reached the Greyhound bus station in town at 2 a.m. The terminal was a miserable, fluorescent-lit concrete bunker smelling of stale tobacco and industrial pine cleaner. She slid her $84 across the grease-stained glass counter to an old man who didn't even look up. "Where to?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "As far south as this gets me," Rayna said. She ended up in a recruiting office in an enlistment center in Norfolk, Virginia, 3 days later. Her feet were still blue from frostbite, her face peeling from the windburn. The recruiter, a grizzled Air Force master sergeant with a sleeve of tattoos, looked at her high school transcripts, the copies she had saved on an old cloud drive, and then looked at her battered canvas bag. "You got the scores for officer candidate school, kid. Hell, you got the scores to go anywhere you want," the sergeant said, scratching his chin. "But you're enlisting. You want the dirty work?" "I want the night, Sergeant," Rayna said, her voice hollowed out by exhaustion but hard as granite. "Put me where nobody wants to fly. Put me where it hurts." 5 years later. October 2024. The Strait of Hormuz. The cockpit of the F-35C, Lightning II, was a cocoon of high-tech sensory deprivation isolated from the world by 3 inches of reinforced canopy glass at 24,000 feet. Below the Persian Gulf was a jagged blade of absolute blackness, interrupted only by the phosphorescent wakes of Iranian patrol boats and the distant burning gas flares of oil refineries on the coast. "Viper 11, this is Overlord," the tactical air controller's voice crackled through Rayna's helmet comms. "The extraction team is pinned at the water's edge. Radar shows 3 mobile surface-to-air missile batteries adjusting tracking toward the beachhead. You are the only asset in the basket. Authorization to engage is free, but you are out of external ordnance." "Copy, Overlord," Rayna said, her breathing rhythmic, a steady hiss click inside her oxygen mask. Going internal. She was no longer the girl in the frozen ditch. Her call sign was Ghost, and she belonged to the shadows. The mission had gone sideways 20 minutes ago. A Navy SEAL reconnaissance platoon hunting for illicit missile shipments had been ambushed on a rocky spit of land near the mouth of the strait. The weather was garbage, low-hanging sulphurous clouds, and a crosswind that made carrier landings a nightmare. Rayna pushed the throttle forward. The single Pratt & Whitney engine roared behind her, pushing her deep into her carbon fiber seat as she went, vertical dropping through the cloud deck into a hornet's nest of anti-aircraft fire. The sky exploded in a lattice of tracer rounds, green and red lines carving through the dark like neon veins. Missile launch, 9 o'clock, her automated voice warning system screamed. The cockpit lit up in amber warning lights. Rayna didn't panic. She threw the jet into a violent 5G brake turn, dropping chaff and flares that burned like dying stars behind her. The enemy missile went past her nose so close the concussive shockwave shook the 20-ton aircraft like a toy, the jet's skin groaning under the aerodynamic stress. She leveled out 50 feet above the black water, skimming the waves to stay beneath the radar floor. Through her helmet's night vision display, she saw them 6 operators trapped against a cliff wall, their backs to the sea, taking heavy machine gun fire from 3 armored personnel carriers closing in on their position. "Hold on, boys," she whispered. She opened the internal weapons bay doors, exposing her final 500-pound GBU-12 laser-guided bomb. She painted the lead armored vehicle with her targeting laser, waited for the solid tone, and pickle-switched the weapon. The bomb dropped. 2 seconds later, a brilliant white-orange fireball erupted on the beach, lifting the armored carrier into the air and scattering the infantry around it. But as she pulled up into a steep climb to clear the cliffs, a secondary unmonitored shoulder-fired missile streaked from the ridgeline. Impact. The detonation occurred at her starboard flank. Shrapnel from the warhead ripped through the composite skin of the fuselage, shredding the hydraulic lines of the right side flap and entering the engine bay. The jet shuddered violently, the engine screaming as turbine blades disintegrated inside the core. Warning engine fire. Right side. Oil pressure declining. The computer voiced calmly an infuriatingly polite contrast to the hell-breaking loose inside the cockpit. Thick, acrid smoke began to bleed into her air supply through the environmental control system. The cockpit lights cycled from amber to a flashing emergency red. "Viper 11 Overlord, your tail is on fire. Eject, eject." Below her, the SEALs were scrambling onto a low-profile rescue boat that had just slipped into the surf under the cover of her strike. If she ejected now, she would drift down right into the hands of the militia on the coast, and the rescue boat would be hunted down by the remaining enemy assets. "Negative, Overlord." Rayna grunted, fighting the control stick with both hands as the hydraulic pressure bled out. "The boys aren't clear yet. I'm holding the line." With one engine failing and spitting fire into the night sky, she turned the crippled stealth fighter back toward the coast, using her remaining gun ammunition to strafe the ridgeline, drawing the enemy's radar and fire away from the water. She flew through a wall of flak, her aircraft rattling like a bucket of bolts, until the telemetry screen confirmed the rescue boat had hit international waters. Only then did she nurse the burning, smoking husk of her F-35C back out toward the open sea, fighting every inch of the airframe, until she managed a blind, terrifying, arrested landing on the pitching deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The moment her tailhook snagged the wire, the engine seized completely, bursting into a wall of flame that the ship's crash crew buried in foam within seconds. When they pulled her from the cockpit, her flight suit was soaked in hydraulic fluid, and her own blood from a shrapnel tear in her thigh. But she was breathing. 2 months later, the Pentagon did what it always did with miracles it didn't want the world to see. In a windowless, soundproofed room in the basement of the Department of Defense, a 4-star general pinned the Air Force Cross, the nation's second-highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism, to Rayna's crisp blue uniform blouse. There were no cameras. There were no reporters. The citation didn't mention the Strait of Hormuz, the SEAL platoon, or the F-35C. It spoke only of conspicuous gallantry while participating in an undesignated aerial flight under classified operations. "Your file is being moved to the black budget captain," the general said, his voice quiet as he shook her hand. "As far as the public record is concerned, this mission never occurred, and your aircraft was lost during a routine training exercise due to mechanical failure. I'm sorry we can't give you a parade." "I didn't do it for a parade, sir," Rayna said, looking down at the heavy gold cross in the velvet box. "I know," the general sighed. "But your family, they've been making inquiries through congressional staffers about your service record. They're trying to verify your employment status for some family estate dispute. Under national security protocols, we had to issue them the standard administrative response." Rayna felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Which is that you are classified as an administrative logistics clerk, grade GS07, currently performing clerical oversight and parts inventory management at a storage depot in Washington. The general looked slightly uncomfortable. We had to minimize your profile to keep foreign intelligence from looking into why Vance is flying frontline stealth assets. To your mother and brother, you're just a bureaucrat counting bolts. Rayna let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like cracking ice. Perfect. A week later, it was Thanksgiving. Rayna had received a mandatory automated email invitation from Eleanor's personal secretary, not from Eleanor herself, notifying her that her attendance was requested at the annual family dinner at the Manhattan penthouse to maintain appearance guidelines for the upcoming Sterling Oil merger press announcement. She arrived in civilian clothes, a simple black sweater that hid the surgical scars on her shoulder, and a pair of trousers that covered the deep purple shrapnel tracks on her leg. She kept the velvet box containing the Air Force Cross deep inside the pocket of her old canvas rucksack, which she left in the penthouse coat closet next to a row of $3,000 mink coats. The dining room was a gallery of gold leaf and crystal. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, looking radiant and utterly untouched by time. Julian sat to her right, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit, his face already carrying the soft, slightly bloated look of a young man who had never skipped a meal or worked a double shift. Ah, the government employee returns. Julian sneered as Rayna took her seat at the far end of the table, away from the center of conversation. Tell us, Rayna, did you manage to find all the missing light bulbs in the Pentagon supply closet this quarter? Or are you still drowning in paperwork? A few of the cousins around the table chuckled behind their linen napkins. Julian, don't be boorish, Eleanor said, though her tone lacked any real reprimand. She didn't look at Rayna as she cut her squab. Rayna chose her path. Some people are simply meant for supportive roles in life. The world needs people to count the inventory so that the people who build empires have the tools they need. She finally raised her eyes, her cold gray gaze locking onto Rayna across the expanse of the silver-laden table. I understand your current salary doesn't even cover the cost of the wine we are drinking tonight, Eleanor said evenly. The offer regarding the Sterling family remains on the table, provided you sign the necessary transfer papers for your grandfather's remaining shares to Julian before the markets open on Monday. It would certainly elevate you from whatever it is you do in those gray government cubicles. Rayna reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, sharp edges of the Air Force Cross. She felt the phantom ache in her thigh where the shrapnel had torn through her flesh. She remembered the sound of the enemy anti-aircraft fire ripping through the night sky, and she remembered the look on the faces of the 6 men she had saved from the beach when they boarded the carrier. They thought she was a clerk. They thought she was small. They thought she was a broken piece of machinery they had discarded in the trash 5 years ago. She took a slow sip of her water, set the glass down with a quiet, precise click, and smiled at her mother. It was the first real smile Rayna had worn in that house in her entire life. I like my cubicle, Eleanor, Rayna said softly, her voice carrying a strange, heavy weight that caused the laughter at the table to die down. You'd be amazed at what I see flying under the radar. The air conditioning inside, the Obsidian Apex, a private soundproofed VIP tribunal room overlooking the fog-choked expanse of the San Francisco Bay, had a specific chemical quality. It smelled of expensive Italian leather biometric security scanners, and the kind of absolute corporate power that bought and sold laws before they could even hit the Senate floor. Rayna Vance didn't walk into the room. She broke the perimeter. She had landed less than 45 minutes ago at Travis Air Force Base, bringing an RQ-180 high-altitude reconnaissance platform through an atmospheric pressure cell that would have ripped the wings off a commercial airliner. There had been no time to change. She wore her dark blue Air Force service dress uniform, the fabric heavy and stiff, her silver captain's bars catching the stark, shadowless LED lighting of the tribunal room. But it was her boots that drew the eyes of the room. They weren't the polished, low-quarter patent leather shoes required for a formal legal hearing. They were her operational flight boots, battered, scuffed combat leather stained around the soles, with the dark, iridescent sheen of JP-8 jet fuel and hydraulic fluid from her post-flight inspection. With every step she took across the pristine white marble floor, she left a faint gray, oily print, a reminder of the dirt they had spent a lifetime pretending didn't exist. "You're late, Rayna," Eleanor Vance said from the head of the mahogany conference table. She didn't look up from her screen, her fingers flicking through a secure digital docket. "As usual, your government commitments seem to supersede your obligations to the family that built you." To Eleanor's right sat Arthur Vance, Rayna's biological father. He looked older than he had at the Thanksgiving dinner in New York, his hair perfectly silvered, his spine rigid, but his eyes carried the hollow, desperate look of a gambler who had leveraged his last acre of land. Next to him was Julian, already pouring himself a glass of Dom Pérignon from a silver ice bucket, his eyes bloodshot from a 3-day bender in Silicon Valley. But it was the man at the foot of the table who commanded the legal architecture of the room. Marcus Sterling, the chief legal architect for Sterling Oil and the Vance Global Conglomerate. A man whose billing rate was higher than the annual pension of a disabled combat veteran, his face a mask of smooth, sociopathic certainty. "Captain Vance," Sterling said, his voice a polished baritone purr as he gestured to the empty leather chair opposite the family. "Or should we refer to you by your payroll designation, GS07 Logistics Specialist? Please sit. We have quite a bit of deferred maintenance to settle regarding your account." Rayna remained standing. She didn't pull the chair out. She stood at the position of attention, her spine straight, her hands resting naturally at her sides. On her left breast, the rows of ribbons, the Air Force. Across the Purple Heart, the Meritorious Service Medal formed a dense, colorful block of silent history. To the civilian eye, they were just colored bars. To Sterling and her family, they were simply badges of an unprofitable hobby. "I have exactly 20 minutes before my operational debrief window closes," Rayna said, her voice dropping into the flat, unreadable monotone of a pilot locked into a tactical data link. "State your motion." Marcus Sterling adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Savile Row suit, a thin, patronizing smile touching his lips. He slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the marble table toward her. It landed with a heavy, deliberate thud. "The motion, Captain, is an invoice," Sterling said, leaning back and weaving his fingers together. "For 15 years you lived under the roof of the Vance estate. You consumed resources, received elite preparatory education, utilized private medical care, and enjoyed the security of a name that opens doors globally. Yet for the past 5 years, you have withheld your grandfather's legacy shares that are legally tied to the Alaska Data Vault infrastructure, while drawing a comfortable taxpayer-funded security allowance in Washington." Julian let out a loud, wet laugh, setting his champagne glass down with an arrogant smirk. "Let's call it what it is, Marcus," Julian chimed in, his voice dripping with malice as he looked Rayna up and down, his eyes lingering on her grease-stained boots. "She's a parasite. She sits in some gray bunker in D.C. counting manifests approving shipping labels for aircraft nuts and bolts, while the rest of us are out here actually moving the capital that funds the defense budget she hides behind. You think that uniform makes you special, Rayna? It just means you're a clerk who gets paid in government discounts." He rose from his chair, his movements slightly erratic from the alcohol, and walked over to where Rayna stood. He held his crystal flute over her boots, tilting it deliberately. A heavy sparkling amber drop of Dom Pérignon fell from the rim, landing squarely on the scuffed toe of her left flight boot, sizzling slightly against the residual layer of jet engine oil. "Oops," Julian whispered, leaning close enough that Rayna could smell the stale mints and expensive liquor on his breath. "Looks like you missed a spot during your warehouse inspection, Captain. Squeeze the Alaska data keys out of your pocket, or I'll have Marcus file a federal lien against your little government salary before the sun sets." Rayna didn't blink. She didn't look down at her boot. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. The box breathing method she had learned during high-G centrifuge training kicked in automatically. Her heart rate, which had spiked slightly when Julian stepped into her personal space, dropped instantly, locking flat at exactly 60 beats per minute. Her vision sharpened the room, losing its color, until Julian, Eleanor, and Sterling were just high-contrast targets on a radar scope. "The Alaska data vaults are federally protected sovereign infrastructure," Rayna said, her voice so steady it sounded digital. "They house the deep space telemetry links for the Northern Command early warning array. They cannot be transferred to a private oil conglomerate." "They can, when the alternative is your public liquidation," Marcus Sterling countered cold-bloodedly. He opened the ledger on the table, turning the pages toward the 3 federal observers, sitting quietly in the glass-walled observation booth behind them. Representatives from the Department of Energy and Defense Logistics, who had been subpoenaed under the guise of an estate verification. "We have compiled the numbers, Rayna," Sterling announced, his voice rising so it would carry through the glass. "From age 3 to 18, private tutoring, $84,000 a year. Specialized physical therapy after your childhood equestrian accident, $212,000. Wardrobe, travel, security, logistics for your debutante presentation. The total cost of your upbringing comes to exactly $4.7 million, a debt you have converted into zero return for this family. Arthur Vance." She slammed the crystal glass down on the table. The sound was like a pistol shot in the small room, the crystal fracturing slightly at the base, sending a hairline crack through the glass. "Look at me when your counsel is speaking to you, girl!" Arthur roared, his face flushing a dangerous dark red. "I gave you life. I gave you my name. And you stand there in that ridiculous grease-stained costume acting like you're above the blood that bought your freedom. You are a Vance first, a soldier second, and currently you are a liability to this family's survival." He stood up, leaning his heavy frame across the table, his eyes boring into her with the practiced authority of a patriarch who had never been questioned. "We have already prepared the media rollout," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, vicious hiss. "You think your little military career is safe? If those Alaska data shares aren't signed over to Julian by midnight, Marcus will release your full medical history from your enlistment physical to the press. We'll have every major network running pieces on your psychological instability, the trauma from your father's death, your delusional claims about special operations, your erratic behavior. We will paint you as a broken, unstable clerk who stole corporate secrets. By Monday morning, the Air Force won't just fire you, they'll dump you in a psychiatric ward at Walter Reed to protect their own image." Eleanor didn't say a word. She merely watched, her face smooth, satisfied, enjoying the performance. She had spent 18 years systematically breaking Rayna's spirit, and she knew exactly where the joints were. She expected the girl to crack. She expected the tears, the desperate plea for family mercy, the signature on the digital tablet. Instead, the room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The only sound was the low electric hum of the server racks behind the wall and the rhythmic quiet hiss-click of the air vents. Rayna stood frozen, but it wasn't the paralysis of fear. It was the absolute stillness of a predator waiting for the target to enter the terminal phase of the engagement envelope. She looked at Arthur, then at Eleanor, and finally at Julian, who was still grinning, convinced he had just won his kingdom. They had no idea. They didn't know that every single word spoken in this room was being picked up by the subdermal bone conduction microphone sewn into the collar of her dress uniform, a secure military-grade encrypted stream that was routing directly to an NSA data center in Fort Meade, Maryland. They didn't know that by introducing fraudulent invoices involving federal defense infrastructure and threatening to leak classified information to coerce a serving military officer, they had just crossed from a civil estate dispute into a Title 18 federal security violation.
"You have 5 minutes remaining on your window, Captain,"
Marcus Sterling said, sliding the digital pen toward her. "Sign, or we pull the trigger on the media campaign." Rayna reached out her hand. For a fraction of a second, Julian's grin widened. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, ready to close the file and move on to the next acquisition. But Rayna didn't take the pen. Instead, she reached into the heavy pocket of her dress uniform blouse and pulled out a small encrypted thumb drive painted a flat military black with a single red security seal across the seam. She set it down on top of the portfolio, right on the line where her signature was supposed to go.
"What is this?"
Sterling asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the drive.
"We don't accept counter-proposals." "That isn't a proposal, Mr. Sterling,"
Rayna said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming cold enough to freeze the water in their glasses. "That is a national security directive issued under the authority of the Secretary of Defense, signed 2 hours ago while I was over the Pacific." She looked directly into Eleanor's pale gray eyes. "5 years ago, you told me I was a line item," Rayna said softly.
"You told me I was a legal zero.
You thought I was counting bolts in Washington because that was the administrative lie the Pentagon fed you to protect my operational security. But you forgot one thing about logistics, Eleanor." She leaned down slightly, placing both her hands flat on the mahogany table, her eyes locking them all into place like a missile lock. "The person who counts the supply line is the one who controls the fuel," Rayna whispered. "The Alaska data vaults aren't my inheritance. They are the primary storage hubs for the Air Force's black budget operational logs. The moment you entered this room with falsified civilian invoices to leverage sovereign military infrastructure, you didn't trigger an estate settlement. You triggered a counterintelligence intercept." The heavy reinforced steel doors of the obsidian apex clicked. The electronic lock didn't turn green. It glowed a solid emergency red. From the observation booth behind the glass, the 3 federal officials didn't leave through the back door. They stepped into the room accompanied by 2 armed federal marshals wearing dark suits and tactical lanyards.
"Marcus Sterling, Eleanor Vance, Arthur Vance,"
the lead marshal said, his voice flat as he pulled a set of federal warrants from his jacket. "Under Section 793 of the Espionage Act, you are being detained for questioning regarding the unauthorized targeting of classified defense logistics. Step away from the table." Julian's face went entirely white, his hand shaking so violently he dropped his champagne glass, the crystal shattering against the marble floor, splashing his own expensive shoes with the sparkling wine.
"Rayna, what the hell is this?"
Julian screamed, his voice cracking as a marshal moved behind him, grabbing his wrists.
"Mother, tell them who we are."
Eleanor didn't move. For the first time in her life, her mask of corporate perfection cracked, her lips parting in a silent, horrified realization as she looked at her stepdaughter. Rayna didn't look back. She turned on the heel of her battered, fuel-stained combat boots, leaving a final dark print on the white marble as she walked toward the exit.
"Your 20 minutes are up,"
Rayna said to the empty air as the doors sealed behind her. The atmosphere within the obsidian apex did not simply shift. It solidified into something heavy, pressurized, and deadly. The federal marshals did not immediately drag Eleanor and Julian from the room. Instead, they formed a human perimeter around the perimeter of the mahogany table, their hands resting flat against the slick polymer grips of their holstered sidearms. At the center of the raised judicial bench sat Federal Judge Harold Bennett. Bennett was a veteran of the Southern District of California, a man whose reputation had been forged in the high-stakes fires of federal antitrust litigation and military procurement oversight. His face was usually a mask of dry, bureaucratic indifference, the face of a man who had seen every corporate shell game, every hidden offshore account, and every desperate piece of political theater the elite could throw at a courtroom.
Order!
Judge Bennett said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that instantly cut through Julian's panicked whimpering.
Counsel, reseat your clients.
Nobody is leaving this chamber until I review the supplementary filings submitted via the Department of Defense secure link. Marcus Sterling. His face pale, but his legal arrogance still flickering like a dying match, took a step forward.
Your Honor, this is a flagrant overreach of administrative authority. My clients are here to settle a civil estate matter regarding private infrastructure shares in Alaska. The military has no standing to lock down a private corporate arbitration.
Sit down, Mr. Sterling,
Bennett snapped, not even looking at the lawyer. The judge reached into a secure biometric lockbox built into the bench. He pulled out a heavy red-bordered folder stamped with the highest clearance markings available to the federal judiciary top secret / special access program / Mark 10 protocol. Inside the folder was a single heavily encrypted solid-state data drive containing a file labeled simply Operational History and Sovereign Encumbrance, Vance RD OCX. Judge Bennett inserted the drive into his secure terminal. The shadowless LED lights of the room reflected off his glasses as the screen flashed, demanding his biometric fingerprint and a 24-character alphanumeric clearance key provided directly by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As the file decrypted, the silence in the room became absolute. The only sound was the dry, rhythmic ticking of the digital clock on the wall. Rayna stood perfectly still at the foot of the table, her boots still holding that single sparkling drop of Julian's dropped champagne remained rooted to the floor. Her chest rose and fell in perfect synchronized 4-second intervals. For the first 30 seconds, Judge Bennett's expression remained unreadable. But then as his eyes scanned down the third page of the digital document, specifically the section containing the unredacted tactical data logs from October 2024, his hand stopped moving on the trackpad. His jaw tightened. The color slowly drained from his weathered cheeks, leaving him looking suddenly older, stripped of his judicial detachment. His eyes darted from the screen to Rayna, then back to the screen tracking a specific set of coordinates and a name listed under the Personnel Recovered section of the Black Budget Manifest.
My God,
Bennett whispered. The words were not a legal ruling. They were a raw, involuntary gasp of human realization. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Harold Bennett pushed his chair back from the bench. In a federal courtroom, the judge never moves for the audience. The room moves for the judge. But Bennett did something that broke every unwritten rule of judicial protocol. He stood up, adjusted the front of his black silk robes, and stepped down from the elevated dais, walking directly onto the marble floor where the civilians and military personnel stood. Julian smirked, leaning toward his mother.
See, he's going to throw her out. The old man knows who pays the taxes in this state.
Eleanor didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on Bennett's face, and what she saw there made her stomach drop into a cold, bottomless pit. It wasn't anger. It was reverence. Judge Bennett stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Rayna. He did not look at her scuffed flight boots or her grease-stained uniform. He looked into her eyes, the eyes of a woman who had stared into the teeth of a surface-to-air missile array and didn't blink. Then the federal judge brought his right hand up to his brow, delivering a crisp, trembling textbook military salute. The entire room froze. Marcus Sterling froze mid-objection, his mouth hanging open. Julian's smirk vanished so fast he nearly choked on his own saliva. Arthur Vance gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned yellow.
Captain Vance,
Judge Bennett said, his voice thick with an emotion he could barely control, his hand still held at his brow.
On October 14th, 2024, a Navy SEAL reconnaissance platoon was cut off on a rocky spit in the Strait of Hormuz. The lead team commander, the man who was trapped in that burning, isolated defile, the man you pulled out of the fire while your own engine was melting behind your ribs, that was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Bennett. The judge lowered his hand, his eyes shining with a mixture of raw grief and immense pride. That was my only son, Captain. For 2 years, the Department of the Navy told me his rescue was a mechanical miracle, an automated extraction. They lied to protect your identity. I have spent 700 days wondering whose face I needed to look at to say thank you for my son's life.
Bennett turned his head, his gaze sweeping across Eleanor, Arthur, and Julian with a disgust so pure it felt like a physical blow.
And I find out today that the woman who bled to keep my son from being executed on a foreign beach is being dragged into my chamber by a pack of corporate wolves trying to invoice her for the cost of her childhood food.
Bennett's voice rose to a roar that shook the glass partitions.
You call her an administrative clerk. You call her a parasite. Your Honor.
Sterling stammered, his legal armor completely shattered.
We were operating under the official employment verification documents provided by the Washington Logistics Depot. The Washington Logistics Depot was a security mask designed to keep foreign intelligence from finding out that the apex predator of the Night Strike Tactical Wing belonged to the United States Air Force.
Bennett slammed his hand down onto the portfolio.
And you just brought your corporate fraud directly into the crosshairs of a national security operation. With the court's permission.
A new voice cut through the air. Stepping out from the shadow of the observation booth was Captain David Vance Miller, a senior military prosecutor from the Judge Advocate General's Court. He carried a secure military tablet linked directly to the federal projector system. With a single swipe of his thumb, the massive LED screens lining the walls of the Obsidian Apex flickered to life.
Let's look at the actual ledger of debt in this family.
Captain Miller said, his tone dry and clinical.
Since the defendants have chosen to bring civil financial claims against Lieutenant General Rayna Vance, we are legally required to enter the unredacted financial audits from the DOCX file into the permanent record.
The screen split into 2 columns. On the left were the fraudulent invoices. Sterling had compiled the $84,000 for tutoring, the $200,000 for medical care. On the right was a series of encrypted federal wire transfers flashing in bright, undeniable green.
March 2021.
Captain Miller read aloud, his voice echoing in the silent room.
Vance Global Logistics was targeted by the Internal Revenue Service for a $50,000 systemic tax fraud discrepancy. Eleanor Vance was facing a public federal indictment that would have collapsed the family's credit line before the North Sea bidding war. This transfer here originating from a specialized hazard duty combat allowance account listed under Captain Vance's operational profile discreetly liquidated that debt. She paid your taxes while she was flying night sorties over the Horn of Africa, Eleanor.
Eleanor's hands began to shake. She reached for her iPad, but her fingers could barely track the screen.
That was an anonymous corporate injection from an offshore institutional investor. That investor was a blind trust managed by the Department of the Navy to keep your company solvent so it wouldn't disrupt the military supply chain.
Miller corrected coldly. He swiped the screen again. A new set of court documents from Ohio appeared dated August 2023.
Let's look at the heir apparent.
Miller continued, turning his gaze to Julian, who was now sweating through his Brioni suit.
August 2023, Julian Vance was caught bribing an Ohio State logistics inspector to overlook a substandard steel shipment meant for commercial freight liners. The fine was $350,000, accompanied by a mandatory felony filing. This transaction here, drawn from Rayna Vance's Military Honor Trust, a fund established by her late biological mother, was used to quiet the Ohio State prosecutor under a non-disclosure agreement.
Rayna did not look at her brother. She didn't need to. She remembered the nights she had spent in the barracks living off standard military rations, her body aching from high G stress fractures, while her inheritance was quietly drained via automated wire transfers to keep Julian out of an orange jumpsuit.
You didn't build her, Julian,
Miller said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet register.
She bought your freedom twice over with the skin off her back, and you just poured champagne on her boots.
This is irrelevant. Arthur Vance muttered, his voice hollow, his hands trembling as he tried to find his footing.
The Alaska data vaults. They belong to the family trust. The grandfather's will was explicit. Julian is the chairman. We have the right to leverage those assets to secure the drone supply contracts with Vance Heavy Avionics.
There is no Vance Heavy Avionics, Rayna said. It was the first time she had spoken since the judge had stepped down. Her voice didn't carry anger. It carried the cold, absolute weight of an orbital strike. She reached out and tapped the terminal screen on the table. The DOCX file executed its final subroutine.
6 months ago, Julian,
Rayna said, looking directly at her brother.
You signed a procurement agreement with the Defense Logistics Agency to supply lightweight titanium aluminum alloys for the next generation autonomous drone fleet. You didn't source that metal from American foundries. You bought low-grade porous scrap from a black market broker in the South China Sea, and you falsified the metallurgical manifests using the Alaska Data Vault's digital signatures.
Julian's breath hitched. He looked at Marcus Sterling, but the lawyer had already stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of absolute surrender to the federal marshals.
You thought nobody was watching the warehouse manifests because I was just a clerk.
Rayna continued, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel.
But the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, has had a tracker on your corporate network since the day you touched that steel. The file you are looking at on that screen isn't an estate dispute. It's a treason indictment.
The screens turned a solid flashing red. A single high-security prompt appeared across every device in the room. Network Protocol Lockdown / Authority, Lieutenant General R. Vance / Origin Defense Information Systems Agency.
Effective at 800 hours this morning,
Rayna announced, her eyes fixed on Eleanor's frozen face. Vance Heavy Avionics has been stripped of its federal supply certifications. Your corporate assets are frozen under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The Alaska data vaults have been permanently integrated into the Northern Command defense grid under sovereign military title. She walked past her father, past her mother, and stopped right in front of Julian. She looked down at the small puddle of champagne on her flight boot, then lifted her eyes to his wet, terrified face. You wanted me to sign a contract, Julian, Rayna said softly. But the only thing you're signing today is a booking sheet at a federal holding facility. Judge Bennett stepped back onto his bench, his face grim, his wooden gavel held high.
Marshals, clear the room. Take the defendants into immediate federal custody under the Mark 10 National Security Warrant. This tribunal is adjourned.
The heavy steel doors of the obsidian apex swung open, and the hallway outside was no longer empty. It was lined with a full detachment of Air Force security forces, their rifles held across their chests, their faces masks of stone. Julian began to scream as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, his expensive suit tearing slightly as the marshals forced him out of his chair. Arthur slumped forward against the table, his breath coming in ragged, broken gasps as his empire vanished beneath his feet. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her pale eyes wide with the realization that the daughter she had thrown into the shredder 5 years ago had just dismantled her world without ever raising her voice. Rayna Vance turned her back on them for the last time. She walked out of the room, her scuffed combat boots striking the marble floor with a clean, rhythmic, and final authority. Her night had just begun. The legal armor of Marcus Sterling did not merely fail, it dissolved. The chief counsel for Sterling Oil and the Vance Global Empire, a man who had built a 30-year career on the absolute certainty that every human being had a price and every law had a loophole, looked at the digital terminal. The flashing red text of the Mark X protocol reflected across his gold-rimmed glasses, illuminating the terrifying reality he had just blindly walked into. This was not a civil dispute over a deceased grandfather's estate. This was a Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, counterintelligence cleanup operation. The woman standing before him, whose combat boots he had just allowed his client to defile with expensive champagne, was not a GS-07 supply clerk. She was a lieutenant general, a black budget phantom who held the theater-wide deployment codes for the nation's early warning data infrastructure. Sterling didn't offer a legal defense. He didn't invoke attorney-client privilege. His survival instinct, honed in the shark-infested waters of corporate mergers, overrode 3 decades of professional vanity. With trembling hands, Sterling slammed his heavy alligator skin briefcase shut. The polished brass latches snapped with a sharp, panicked crack that echoed through the pressurized room. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't look at Arthur, who was staring at him with wide, desperate eyes, silently begging for a motion, a stay of execution, a procedural delay.
My firm is withdrawing representation effective immediately.
Sterling muttered, his voice stripped of its smooth baritone arrogance, reduced to a thin, panicked whisper.
The defendants acted without counsel's knowledge regarding the falsification of metallurgical manifests for federal drone contracts. I am recusing myself from this matter.
Marcus? Eleanor's voice was a sharp, cracking whip of pure disbelief. She reached out her red manicured fingers, clawing at the sleeve of his tailored jacket.
You drafted those infrastructure leverage clauses. You told us she had no federal standing.
You cannot leave this table.
Get your hands off me, Eleanor!
Sterling hissed, ripping his arm away from her grip with a violence that shocked the room. He didn't look back. He practically sprinted toward the secure exit doors, his briefcase clutched against his chest like a shield, abandoning the Vance family to the wolves they had spent a lifetime feeding. Rayna watched him go, her gaze completely horizontal, her eyes tracking his flight with the cold mathematical indifference of a radar dish tracking a retreating chaff cloud.
Let him run,
Rayna said softly to the lead Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS agent standing by the glass.
The FBI is already waiting for him in the underground garage. His corporate server architecture was mirrored to Fort Meade 10 minutes ago.
The heavy steel doors of the obsidian apex slid open completely, and the silence of the room was permanently broken by the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical combat boots. 4 DCIS special agents wearing dark windbreakers with gold federal lettering across the back stepped into the room, flanked by 6 armed Air Force Security Forces personnel. They did not move with the polite hesitation of bailiffs. They moved with the terrifying synchronized efficiency of a federal raid.
Julian Vance,
the lead DCIS agent announced, pulling a heavy blue-bordered arrest warrant from his tactical vest.
Under Title 18, United States Code Section 1031, you are under arrest for major fraud against the United States.
and Section 2151 sabotage of national security infrastructure. Hands behind your back.
Julian's knees did not simply shake, they failed him completely.
The young tycoon who had spent his entire 20s drinking $3,000 bottles of wine and bragging about his federal defense connections collapsed backward off his leather chair, hitting the pristine marble floor with a dull, heavy thud. The crystal champagne flute he had been holding shattered beneath his shoulder, the remaining wine soaking into the fabric of his bespoke Brioni jacket, mixing with the sweat and oil on the floor.
Mother, save me.
Julian shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail as a federal agent stepped over him, pinned his shoulder to the marble with a knee, and pulled his wrists behind his back. The sound of the heavy chrome handcuffs clicking into place was a clean, industrial finality. Click, click, click. It was the exact same sound as the shredder that had destroyed Rayna's academy appointment 5 years ago.
Get off him!
Arthur Vance roared, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple as his paternal instinct finally overrode his corporate calculation. He lunged across the table, his heavy gold Rolex catching the light as he tried to grab the federal agent's arm.
You don't touch my son. Do you know who we are? We are Vance Global. We fund your damn budgets.
Before Arthur's hands could even clear the edge of the mahogany table, 2 Air Force Security Forces personnel moved. They didn't strike him. They simply executed a textbook joint lock manipulation, twisting Arthur's arms behind his back and slamming his chest flat against the table, scattering the crystal glassware and silver water pitchers across the room. Eleanor sat frozen in her seat at the head of the table. Her skin, usually flawless and glowing from expensive Swiss treatments, had turned the color of stale newsprint. Her lips were parted, trembling slightly as she looked down at the table, then up at Rayna, the daughter she had treated as an administrative expense. The girl she had thrown out into a freezing nor'easter with $84 and a canvas rucksack. The child she had mocked as a glorified warehouse clerk who counts light bulbs and bolts. That clerk was currently holding the entire structural weight of their survival in her hand, and her fingers were entirely unyielding. Slowly, the absolute reality of her complete destruction settled into Eleanor's marrow. She looked at her husband pinned to the table, his breath coming in ragged, pathetic gasps. She looked at her son, the golden heir to the Vance fortune, weeping on the marble floor, his face smeared with champagne and dust. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Vance broke. She slid out of her leather chair, her knees hitting the hard, unyielding marble right beside her son. She didn't look like the matriarch of Wall City anymore. She looked like a broken, desperate creature whose currency had suddenly become worthless in a foreign land. She crawled forward 2 steps, her manicured hands reaching for the hem of Rayna's dark blue uniform trousers, right above the grease-stained combat boots. "Rayna, please," Eleanor cried, her voice cracking, tears streaming through her heavy makeup, leaving dark gray tracks down her cheeks. "He's your brother. He's Julian. He didn't know. He didn't understand the security parameters. Use your intelligence clearance. Call the Pentagon. Call whoever you need to call. Tell them it was a corporate mistake. Tell them we will transfer the entire Vance Global infrastructure to the military for free. Just don't let them take my son to a federal penitentiary." Rayna stood perfectly still. She didn't pull her boot away from Eleanor's reaching fingers, but she didn't bend down to help her either. She stood like an obelisk of cold granite, her chest rising and falling in that same unyielding 4-second tactical rhythm. From the shadow near the exit door, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a sterile white naval medical uniform stepped forward. It was Daniel Rayna's husband, a brilliant military trauma surgeon who had spent the last 3 years quietly rebuilding her physical body from the shrapnel tears she had suffered over the Gulf. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply placed a calm, heavy hand on Rayna's shoulder blade, his presence a silent, impenetrable firewall between her and the parasites at her feet. Rayna reached up, adjusting the stiff brim of her Air Force service cap. The gold-embroidered oak leaves and the silver wings of the eagle emblem caught the harsh LED light, casting a sharp shadow over her eyes. "You're wrong, Eleanor," Rayna said, her voice dropping into a quiet, freezing register that silenced the weeping in the room. "I don't negotiate with corporate parasites who wear $3,000 suits while sabotaging the aircraft that keep our people alive in the sky. You invoiced me for my childhood. You told me every asset has a depreciation schedule." She looked down at Eleanor, her eyes as vacant and beautiful as the San Francisco Bay at midnight. "The invoice for your arrogance has just come due," Rayna whispered. "And currently you are entirely insolvent. Live with it." She turned on the heel of her combat boots, her hand sliding naturally into Daniel's warm, steady grip. They walked out of the obsidian apex together, the heavy electronic doors sealing behind them with a deep hydraulic thud, locking the Vance family inside the tomb they had built for themselves. 3 years later, July 2026, the National Air and Space Museum, Washington, D.C. The summer light streaming through the massive glass pavilion of the Smithsonian was warm, golden, and entirely clear. The vaulting ceiling housed the history of human flight, from canvas gliders to the titanium skins of Mach 3 reconnaissance platforms that had once mapped the world from the edge of space. Rayna walked slowly beneath the massive sweeping wings of a legendary B-52 Strato Fortress. She was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple, elegant charcoal linen dress, a leather watch, and low-heeled leather sandals. There was no uniform, no silver stars on her shoulders, no rows of ribbons commemorating the blood she had left on foreign shores. Her service record had been permanently archived under the highest seal of national gratitude. She was finally off the radar. Clutched tightly in her right hand was the small, warm hand of a 3-year-old girl named Clara. Clara had her father's blonde hair, but her eyes were dark, serious, and incredibly sharp. The Vance eyes before corporate vanity had rotted them from the inside out. When Julian had been sentenced to 25 years at ADX Florence, and Vance Global had been liquidated by the federal bankruptcy courts to pay for the defense infrastructure damage, Julian's socialite wife had simply packed her bags for Europe, leaving the infant child behind like an unreturned luxury rental. Rayna had not hesitated. She had gone to the child welfare depot herself, carrying her military ID and a custody order signed by Judge Harold Bennett himself. "Look up there, Clara," Rayna said softly, pointing toward a sleek black stealth aircraft suspended from the steel rafters above them. "You see that one? That's the bird that flies when the sky gets dark. It doesn't need lights. It doesn't need a crowd to cheer for it. It just keeps the world safe while everybody else is sleeping." The little girl looked up, her eyes wide with wonder, reflecting the clean, unblemished light of the museum. "Does it ever get lost, Auntie Rayna?" Rayna smiled, a beautiful, unburdened expression that reached her eyes, completely free of the shadows from the Vance estate or the red flashing lights of the San Francisco Tribunal. Daniel stepped up beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist, dropping a soft kiss against her hair as they watched the child marvel at the sky. "No, sweetheart," Rayna said, her voice carrying the absolute sovereign certainty of a woman who had broken her chains and built her own sky. "When you fly under your own power, you always know exactly where home is."
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.